Herbal Actions lectures. Today we're going to cover infections and immune is where we're going to start, and I don't know how far I'm going to get, we'll see. With regards to the midterm, I'll discuss that at the end of today's class to figure out where we're going to end. We may not cover all the these topics for the midterm, so I'll let you know where we're going to end. Okay, so with infection and immune herbs, this is an area that I see has lots of potential in the future for medicine. When you consider the fact that there's a lot of antibiotic resistance on the rise, there are lots of drugs out there that are ineffective or relatively ineffective for viruses. There's lots of strains of malaria that are becoming resistant to drugs, so lots of potential in this area. Now, when it comes to treating infections, there's a couple approaches that you want to take. One, you want to take a herb that can specifically target the bug, whether that's a bacteria, virus, parasite, whatever it is. But you also want to try to help the body fight off the infection better. And so there are herbs that have an immunostimulant effect, which basically helps to enhance the body's natural ability to fight off the virus. And the immunology behind this, like the science behind it, is probably pretty complicated, and I don't fully understand it. But I know that a number of these herbs will affect various cytokines and interleukins in the body to help stimulate the natural white blood cells that can fight off the various bacteria or viruses. So an immunostimulant basically is something that stimulates the immune system. Another term that's related to this is an immunomodulator, and you could, in theory, sort of use these terms interchangeably. I don't know whether or not there's an actual distinction between them, because often I'll find herbs that are classified as an immunostimulant. In another book, it may be called an immunomodulator. And so an immunomodulator is a substance that helps to balance the immune system. And often when I think of immunomodulators, these are herbs that also help the body cope to stress, to boost immune function that would normally be inhibited by some of the stress hormones like cortisol. So the main purpose of giving someone an immunostimulant would be to give her prophylactically to help prevent an infection. So if you're going through a period of time where you know a lot of people are getting sick around you, or the weather's changing outside and it's kind of stressful in the body, or you might be doing a lot of traveling. So you could take these prophylactically for a period of time to help boost your immune function to prevent you from getting sick during those periods where you think you're going to be vulnerable. Other times you might consider taking these as obviously to treat an infection. So if you have an active infection, you might take an immunostimulant to help the body fight off the infection. But also if you were to take some kind of chemotherapy or radiation treatment or some other type of, if you're going through something where your immune system's suppressed, then you could take immunostimulants to try to boost that up. So sometimes when people are being treated for cancer, they're more susceptible to illness, so you might take an immunostimulant to boost the various white blood cells to help fight off infection. But also, in addition, a lot of these immunostimulants could be used, depending on the type of immunostimulant, it could be used to boost natural killer cells, which also can have a positive effect on fighting off cancer and stimulating the body to fight cancer. Okay? So, there are a few different types of immunostimulants. I think purple coneflower or echinacea, there's a few different species of it, but this is sort of the flagship, or sort of, this is the mascot for natural medicine. And you'll find it's included in a lot of formulas used to treat colds and flus. I use it sometimes. I think it's a good herb. The research is a little bit mixed on it. To go into a little bit, I won't go into too much detail on it, but just to be aware that the roots and the aerial parts have different phytochemicals in it. So the aerial parts have certain classes of phytochemicals, including carbohydrates and some phenolic compounds that appear to have an immune stimulating effect. And the roots contain other types of compounds called the alkylamines. We won't really talk about them too much, but just to mention them in passing, that these compounds also boost immune function. And what they find, or what I think is going on, is that the aerial parts have a much more rapid immunostimulating effect that might kick in after a day or two, while research suggests that the alkylamines in the roots may take a little bit longer to kick in. So research done, clinical trials done using both the aerial parts and the roots have shown to reduce the risk of getting a cold and also decreasing the severity and speeding up recovery from colds. While the alkylamines themselves, although there's lots of research on how they function, how they boost the immune function, the one clinical trial that I looked at that used only the roots found it was ineffective for treating colds and flus. And I kind of suspect that it may be because the alkylamides, they stimulate the immune system through a different mechanism, and they actually bind to a type of cannabinoid receptor, similar to the same cannabinoid receptors that marijuana binds to, but not the ones that cause the psychotropic effect. There's a couple different subgroups in the body. And so when it binds to these receptors, it actually there's a bit of a delay before it starts working. So if you're going to use echinacea acutely for a cold, you best use both the aerial and the roots. If you're using it long term, you could probably use just the roots and it would work quite well. Another herb is hongqi, or that's what it's called in Chinese medicine, or we often refer to as astragalus. This is a herb that's used in traditional Chinese medicine, and I'm just looking over to make sure we're recording this. I hope we are. Good. So the astragalus is used in Chinese medicine for a number of properties. One, it's used to help the body cope with stress, so it's classified as an adaptogen, and is often given to people during periods of stress. It's often recommended for chronic viral infections or to boost the immune system to prevent colds and flus. And it's commonly used in people with going through chemotherapy and radiation to help boost the immune system, reduce fatigue, and increase white blood cell count. So astragalus is a great herb. One warning with some of these immunostimulants is some of them seem to be better at treating bacterial infections. I think echinacea definitely has some research showing benefit for targeting bacteria and yeast and viruses. In the traditional Chinese textbooks, astragalus and some of the other adaptogens are not recommended to take if someone has a suppurative infection, so a pus-forming infection that's usually caused by some type of bacteria. So I usually use astragalus more for things like respiratory tract infections and boosting immune function when people are going through stressful periods. I wouldn't be as inclined to use it for someone who has like an abscess or some serious bacterial infection. So this little recipe here is change the season soup. This is a traditional Chinese formula. You can buy the raw ingredients and mix them up together. And this is used in Chinese medicine, but also it's kind of common knowledge, I think, in a lot of the Chinese population, where this might be, these herbs would be boiled up in a big pot, and it could be drunk as a decoction, basically a hot water extract, or you could turn it into a, like, add it to a soup, use it as a broth for a soup and make chicken soup or something. And this is typically used in the spring and fall when people are most susceptible to getting a cold. So the idea is that you take it during those periods where you might be most susceptible, and so when the seasons change from being really hot or summer-like weather to winter where it's cold, it puts a stress on the immune system. And you may not notice the stress like you would if you're preparing for exams, but it does sort of weaken the body a bit and suppress the immune system. So this helps to boost it up. So you can read that if you want. You don't need to know this for the exam, but the main herb in this is astragalus and another herb called codenopsis. Those are the two main immunomodulators, immunostimulants. Chinese lychee berries also, or wolfberries, also have some immunomodulating, immunostimulating effects. This is a tea that I often will drink in the wintertime, and it's basically I use fresh ginger and a little bit of powdered Siberian ginseng. Siberian ginseng is another good immunomodulator, adaptogen that helps the body cope with stress. You can also add a little bit of licorice, that's optional. Licorice has some good antiviral properties we'll talk about shortly. And then cinnamon, just because I like the taste of cinnamon. And I find if I drink this in the wintertime, it has a very warming effect. It kind of has an earthy taste to it. And it's quite pleasant. You could also use other types of ginseng as well, like Panax ginseng or Korean ginseng, which is Panax ginseng, or American ginseng as well. Now, another herbal action is an antipyretic. Now, an antipyretic, in Latin, I think pyro means fire or heat, so antipyretic means to alleviate a fever. And so typically herbs that do this they may or may not directly affect an infection. So they may not have an immunostimulating effect. In some cases, they may have an immunosuppressive effect. It depends. When you think about drugs that typically have an antipyretic effect, it would be something like the NSAIDs, like aspirin or ibuprofen. Also, things like acetaminophen or Tylenol. Those drugs, they don't really do anything for your immune function. They just sort of, or they just affect certain, I guess, what do you call them, prostaglandins in the body to decrease fever. So there's a couple related actions. A febrifuge and antiperiodic are also two other things that are related to this. So a febrifuge is just cinnamon for antipyretic. And antiperiodic, this is also the same as an antimalarial. It's used when someone has alternating hot and cold fever, so like one would have with something like malaria, where they go through periods where they have a really high fever and then it goes down and they get the chills and it bounces back up. That's called an antiperiodic, and that periodic is just because of the time. It refers to periodic changes in the fever. So I don't typically use antipyretic herbs very often. I don't really see the need to suppress fever in most people. Generally speaking, fevers are beneficial and they help the body fight off the infection. So most of the time a fever is safe. Now there are times where if a fever gets too high, it can be a bit dangerous. Sometimes people will go, they'll just feel really sick and uncomfortable, so that might be an indication for reducing a fever. In extreme cases, if the body gets too warm or too hot, it can cause a person to go into seizures and suffer from some other really negative side effects. So there's certainly a place to suppress a fever, but with most patients, I don't really bother doing this. And frankly, with children, there's lots of safe ways you can do it with prescription drugs. Some of these other herbs that would not necessarily be safe to give to children. So where you might use it is someone had a really extreme fever and you needed to control the symptoms to make the person feel more comfortable so they could get a good night's sleep. But otherwise, I would probably just try to work with the fever as much as possible and use some other herbs. So two classic herbs that have been used: willow, and if you remember, willow is the source of salicylic acid, which is basically the precursor for acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin, and also feverfew. Now, if you know anything about biochemistry and the different pathways in the bodies. Remember when we talked about inflammation and the inflammatory processes using various enzymes like cyclooxygenase and now just to be aware that cyclooxygenase is just one of the enzymes involved in inflammation, and different prostaglandins get produced from that. And there's a particular prostaglandin E2, so PGE2, which is involved. It appears like it becomes elevated when people have a fever, and I guess it's one of the things that stimulates the fever or induces a fever. And it appears that willow and feverfew both inhibit the release of this prostaglandin, so that may be one of the mechanisms how it works. So feverfew displayed on the left is in the same family as the daisy. It's the aster family. And you'll see a lot of other herbs that look a lot like it. For example, chamomile and feverfew look very similar. Chamomile's a larger flower, and it definitely has a different taste and smell to it. Other ones like chamomile, echinacea, even, they're all in the same family. So willow on the right-hand side, there are different species of willow. So I wrote down Salix spp, just means Salix species. So there's black willow, white willow. All of them contain salicylic acid. And other fruits and vegetables and plants also have salicylic acid. It just happens to be that willow is particularly high in it. And that's just a study that discusses one of the mechanisms. Prostaglandin synthetase is one of the enzymes involved in the inflammatory pathway that is responsible for producing fevers, or at least one of the things. Now, the next slide we're going to talk, or next few slides we're going to talk about are antimicrobials. So, microorganisms could include anything from bacteria, viruses, funguses, and parasites. And parasites are divided into other different ones, like ones that cause malaria or leishmaniasis, also amoebas, intestinal worms. So we'll go through and describe these in a little bit more detail, explain them. But if a herb is an antimicrobial, it's just saying in general it's used to treat infections. And what I find is that often herbs that have an antimicrobial effect, they'll often target one or more different microorganisms. So certainly when I look at the research on golden seal, originally I thought golden seal was used primarily for bacterial infections, but then I also noticed that it is used for fungal infections. And then I discovered a little bit of research that shows that it has some antiviral properties. And then I also saw some research that shows that it works for certain types of parasites like amoebas, and it might even have some anti-malarial properties. So something like golden seal or barberry or Oregon grape, which have similar types of phytochemicals, are very broad-acting antimicrobials. So if I say a herb is an antimicrobial, historically it may have an affinity for certain types of infections, but generally speaking, I think it probably works on a number of different types of microorganisms. So an antimicrobial just destroys or inhibits the growth of microorganisms, and it's a very broad term. So herbs like golden seal and myrrh, those are two of my favorite herbs. I use them frequently. They seem to be like a broad spectrum antimicrobial, working for lots and lots of different types of infections. Golden seal, also referred to as Hydrastis canadensis. It's native to Canada, hence the species name there. It also grows in northern U.S. This is one of my favorite herbs to treat both bacterial and fungal infections. I'll pretty much use it in any infection formula that I have. It's relatively expensive in raw form, mainly because the roots take about 3 or 4 years to mature. So that means if you're trying to grow this, unlike other herbs where you could basically get a crop every year from it, so something like elderberries or elderflower, every year it produces a new batch of flowers that you can gather without destroying the plant. With the golden seal, once you harvest the roots, that's all. That's it for that plant. So it tends to be very, very expensive. Um, it's high in various compounds called isoquinoline alkaloids, and you don't need to know this now, but you will after the midterm. And these compounds contain things like berberine, hydrastine, and they're the main active ingredients. We're going to talk about them shortly as well. Now, um, another really important antimicrobial herb is myrrh. Myrrh is the same plant that, when you think about the story of baby Jesus, frankincense, gold, and myrrh, myrrh was one of the gifts that was given by the wise men to baby Jesus, or at least the legend says that. And myrrh, it grows in more, I think, northeast Africa and Middle East sort of area. And it's a resin from a tree. And so basically, incisions are made into a tree and a sap comes out that's collected and dried. And it's often used in incense. And so that's one of the properties because it has a nice smell when it's burned because it's rich in essential oils and some other compounds. And in addition to that, it's been used in herbal medicines probably since the ancient Egyptians. We know that myrrh was often used in some of the solutions used to mummify the bodies of the pharaohs. And so we know it's dating back more than 5,000 years, I'm sure it's been used in medicine. And it's made its way into Western herbalism as well. So a lot of the North American herbalists, it's included in a lot of the classic books used in herbal medicine. So it does not grow in North America, but it's a very valuable herb. And although it tastes terrible, it has sort of tastes like turpentine-ish, that sort of, maybe you've never tried turpentine, but it has that sort of acrid, petroleum-like taste to it because of the various terpenoids that have the antimicrobial property. So these are two herbs that I have an anti-infection formula, and golden seal and myrrh are always in those formulas. A couple other important antimicrobials. Podarco. This is a herb that grows in Central, South America, and also the Caribbean. It's used as an ornamental plant. It's quite pretty. It produces beautiful big pink flowers. I've seen it in towns in Mexico, in various cities in South America. The bark of it, it's used. It's a lot like black walnut that we have in North America here. It has similar types of phytochemicals, and it's a good herb. It has a different class of phytochemicals than the myrrh and the golden seal, and so I often use it in herbal formulas as well. Old man's beard on the right, also referred to as usnea. This grows in the Rockies. It's a good antimicrobial herb. It was used by indigenous first people to both internally but also externally. The moss was gathered and applied as a poultice, so basically the herb was directly placed on wounds to help fight off infection and I guess speed up the healing. So antimicrobials either basically kill or help kill different microorganisms. An antiseptic is different than a disinfectant. A disinfectant is something like bleach that basically kills microorganisms, but it's not really safe to apply to your skin, generally speaking. So you don't really want to use bleach as a disinfectant you don't want to drink bleach or apply it topically. It's just going to burn the tissues. Antiseptics are a little bit safer. They can be applied internally and externally for humans. Generally speaking, a lot of the time antiseptics usually refer to a herb that's used or a substance that's used topically to help reduce the risk of infection, but they can also be used internally and have an effect on the mucous membranes. So this could be in the mouth, but also in the urinary tract. There are certain antiseptics. Generally speaking, when I think of essential oils like tea tree, oregano, thyme, eucalyptus, clove, those essential oils are typically referred to as an antiseptic. And one of the reasons for this is that antiseptics are different than antibiotic in the fact that antibiotics typically have a precise mechanism of action where they target a certain enzyme or protein or transporter or whatever it may be to have their effect. While an antiseptic, it's more of a it's less precise. It just sort of disrupts cellular function. So it might target, let's say, the cell membranes and make them less stable and more permeable. And so that's how a lot of the essential oils work. They don't necessarily go and target an enzyme involved with making DNA or proteins, but rather it just sort of goes in, irritates the cell membranes, makes them a little leakier, and just sort of wounds or weakens the bacteria or viruses. So there are several different antiseptics. Oregano oil is one example. Also thyme. Thyme and oregano, they're both in the mint family, and they have very similar phytochemicals. They both contain carvacrol, which is the main active ingredient in oregano oil, and then thyme, which also has carvacrol, it has thymol as the main active ingredient. So oregano and thyme have the same, more or less, essential oils in it, but thymol is more predominant and it has a little less of the carvacrol, while in oregano oil, the carvacrol is in a higher concentration and a lower amount of the thymol. We'll discuss those a little bit more later on. I don't know if you guys can hear, but my baby's squawking in the background there, so hopefully that's not disrupting things too much. Bearberry, which is also referred to as Arctostaphylos uva ursi, or some people just call it uva ursi. This grows, it grows in Ontario, grows in various parts of North America. It's related to the cranberry and blueberries, so it's in the same family. And typically this plant has a phytochemical that we'll talk about shortly called arbutin, which acts as a urinary antiseptic. So it's an essential oil that has a unique ability to target urinary tract infections. So the next action is an antibacterial. It's pretty self-explanatory. This would be something that kills bacteria specifically. I would say it's probably the same as calling something an antibiotic, but usually antibiotics are referred to pharmaceutical drugs rather than herbs. So antibacterial herbs, as I mentioned before, two of my favorite ones are golden seal and myrrh, but many herbs act as antibacterials. The question is which one's the best antibacterial? And I think it depends on the type of infection that you're dealing with. Now, I'm just going to digress really short, just for a few minutes here, and explain one of the most interesting things I think I've stumbled across in herbal medicine, and that's how plants have a synergistic effect. And when you look at pharmaceutical drugs, generally speaking, as I've mentioned before, a pharmaceutical drug typically has, let's say, 300 milligrams of a particular substance. And so if you look at antibiotics, you're getting penicillin or amoxicillin, and you could be getting Cipro or whatever it is. Generally speaking, when it's prescribed, you're only getting that one antibiotic. And it's having a relatively precise effect in the body. Now, what's neat is that plants have a synergistic effect. While when you consume the whole herb, let's say you consume the entire root of golden seal, or maybe a mixture of golden seal and some of its leaves and flowers, you're not just getting one active ingredient, but rather you're getting numerous different phytochemicals that exist, that could belong to the same group of chemicals, but I would say always, you're not getting just one class of chemicals, you're getting multiple classes. And so with regards to herbs like golden seal, barberry, and Oregon grape, these herbs, if you look at the monographs that explain what you use these herbs for, they have a very similar indications. They tend to be used for all sorts of different infections. Digestive infections is the predominant thing, but also for respiratory tract infections. Excuse me. Now, the main, or one of the main active ingredients in these herbs is a substance called berberine. And berberine is classified as an isoquinoline alkaloid, and we'll talk about these during the phytochemistry later on. In addition to berberine, isoquinoline alkaloids also contain other things. For example, golden seal has high amounts of another compound called hydrastine. It's slightly different than berberine. Those would be the two most important ones, but there are variations of this. So if you consume the whole herb, you could have 3, 4, maybe half a dozen compounds that are similar in structure to berberine that may work the same, may be less effective, or may target a different organism. I'm not sure, or a different receptor. So it appears that from an antibacterial standpoint, berberine may be more effective against gram-positive versus gram-negative, but it does work against both classes of bacteria, and it also appears to have an antifungal, antiparasitic, and an antiviral property. So this is a great broad spectrum antimicrobial. Now, one of the challenges is understanding how these things work. Now, looking at the research, I tried to dig up how precisely berberine might work as an antibiotic, and it does appear that it's involved with inhibiting certain proteins involved with DNA expression of proteins. So when DNA you get the little RNA, messenger RNA comes off, and you start making the proteins from that, it interferes as one of those enzymes or proteins that cleaves the newly formed proteins off of the RNA. I think that's how it works. At least that's so. Basically, it's involved with disrupting the formation of DNA or proteins in the body. So what's interesting, though, is when you look at the research on berberine, is that when you give it as an isolated phytochemical in high amounts, so you give, let's say, a capsule that contains 500 milligrams of berberine, it's going to be relatively ineffective when given alone. And so one of the things that I suspect has happened in the past is that drug companies have gone to have researched things like berberine and isolated it from golden seal or barberry or one of the other plants that contains it, and said, you know what, this isn't a very good antibiotic, because when you test it in the petri dish, bacteria seem to be resistant to it. And so there's no real point in using it as an antibiotic. And this is relatively, and I would say this is true, that berberine alone is ineffective. But we know that golden seal seems to work pretty good as an antibiotic. So what's the difference here? Well, what I think is really interesting is, in addition, certain herbs contain not just the antibacterial or antibiotic type of compound, but they also contain certain phytochemicals that are involved in decreasing drug resistance. And so there's something called an MDR inhibitor, and this basically is a multi-drug resistant pump inhibitor that's found inside these herbs as well. And so I'm just going to skip ahead here. And here's an image of Oregon grape and then barberries on the right-hand side. You'll see these grown as ornamental plants in a lot of people's gardens. I know if I walked outside of the house and walked down the street, within 50 meters, one of my neighbors has both of these growing in the garden. If I walked another couple hundred meters, I would find more of these guys. So they're pretty common. Golden seal is certainly less common and harder to grow. The advantage of Oregon grape and barberry is you don't have to, even though they use the roots, typically they can just sort of cultivate it and just cut some of the roots out and remove them without having to destroy the entire plant. So it's a cheaper way of getting the berberine or berberine containing plants. Now, this little diagram is a little rendition of what I think a bacteria looks like. It kind of looks like a little octopus or something, but I'm just using my imagination there. Now, what's happening here is you'll see that berberine is a positively charged compound, and what happens is inside the cell membrane or cell wall of these various bacteria, it tends to be more negatively charged, and so berberine has a natural affinity just to migrate across the plasma membrane or cell membranes and get into the inside of the cell, and then it can basically disrupt the cellular function and the protein synthesis there. Now, what happens, though, is a lot of bacteria produce multi-drug resistant pumps. And these are specifically designed to pump out positively charged compounds. And so when you look at certain anti-malarials like chloroquine, or you look at some, when you hear about malaria becoming resistant to chloroquine, or certain cancer cells becoming resistant to some chemotherapeutic agent, they're always using some type of pump like this that actively pumps out the antibiotic or the chemotherapeutic agent or antimalarial, so that although it's surrounded by it, it's not actually reaching a high enough concentration inside the cells to have an effect on it. So this is one of the mechanisms that organisms and cancer cells can develop a resistance to a particular drug. They just sort of mutate until they kind of get the right sort of shape for it. So berberine, it appears that a lot of the multi-drug resistant pumps on bacteria seem to be resistant to it. Now, the cool thing about herbs like golden seal and Oregon grape is that in addition to containing the berberine, they have this other phytochemical which acts as an inhibitor for this pump. And so we know that there's a bunch of research studies that show there's a flavonolignin called 5-MHC, which they got to come up with a nicer name for it, something that sounds cooler. But anyways, so this 5-MHC compound, what it will do is it'll block this pump so that it does not directly have an antibiotic or an antimicrobial effect, but rather it works synergistically with the berberine to decrease the drug resistance so that the berberine can be effective. And I think this is really, really neat stuff. Now I'm going to show you another diagram. So we got a log graph here, while the x-axis, it refers to how much of the berberine you need to give, and the y-axis refers to how much of the what percentage of the bacteria culture are dead, depending on the concentration. And so the first thing we'll look at is the berberine. If you give berberine alone, you may have to get or subject the bacteria to about 100 units of berberine. And in this case, that could be too toxic to give to a human. Like it may not be, it may be, you might have to drink like a liter of tincture a day to get that sort of amount into the bloodstream. Or it may not even be possible to do that in a human, because your body will actively pump it out or it won't be absorbed or whatever it is. So the berberine is relatively ineffective for these bacteria. Now, when you look at the 5-MHC, when you add it to a petri dish, no matter how much of this you add, it displays no antibiotic property. So it doesn't matter if you give 1,000,000 tons of this stuff, it will not kill the bacteria. And so berberine by itself is a really, really weak antibiotic. The 5-MHC has no antibiotic properties whatsoever, but when you combine these two together, you're able to get a dose. About 1% is required to have the same lethal therapeutic or lethal, what do you call it, inhibitory growth concentration. And so this is really, really exciting. So why I think this is neat is we're always talking about the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We've also been talking about malaria that's becoming resistant to antiparasitics. We're talking about cancer cells that are becoming resistant to drugs. And so medical doctors are constantly, and research are constantly trying to develop new drugs to try to combat this resistance. And so a new antibiotic, a new parasitic, a new chemotherapeutic agent. But I think eventually, and I think we're already kind of getting there, we're running out of ways to kill bacteria. Like we haven't made major drug discoveries in the last 10 years for new antibiotics. So what I think is neat is instead of working on developing new antibiotics, why don't we just develop new drugs that we take along with old antibiotics that target these multi-drug resistant pumps. And so this is exciting stuff. Now, this is one of the studies. There's some more recent studies done. This was done in 2000, which is, I guess, 15 years ago. So we've known about this for a while. there's more research that's come out on this topic since then, but this diagram here is the same as the pretty diagrams that I showed before. I just made it look nicer. Now, what's kind of neat is you'll learn about flavonolignans later on, but barberry and the golden seal and the Oregon grape, they contain various flavonolignans. So here we've got the 5-MHC at the top, and at the bottom there's a compound called silibin, which is also a flavonolignan found in milk thistle. Now, milk thistle doesn't have any antibiotic properties, and it doesn't really have any, it's not used in any way for anti-malaria or antibiotics or anything like that. But why I'm mentioning this is that studies that I've looked at, often cancer oncologists will tell their patients you should not take any antioxidants if you're going through chemotherapy, because many of the antioxidants could, in theory, or could potentially decrease the efficacy of the various chemotherapeutic drugs. And so because doctors they have a prejudice against natural products, they don't always look at the research. They just assume that it's not going to do anything and that it could potentially interfere with what the drugs are doing, so therefore it's best not to do it. Now, I think what we need to do is look at the research on this and go based on the evidence, not based on what somebody believes or thinks is the case. What's neat about milk thistle is, although it's a good antioxidant, it's typically used as a liver herb. But what's neat about milk thistle is that if you give it to someone going through certain types of chemotherapy, although it's an antioxidant, it does appear to have a hepatoprotective effect. It protects the liver, but it might actually decrease drug resistance. And so rather than interfering with the chemotherapeutic agent, it actually enhances the anti-cancer properties and decreases resistance. And so here's just one study that basically showed that this compound, not only does it have the silibin has a pro-apoptotic, so it means it helps to target these cancer cells and get them to stimulate apoptosis, which is sort of like a cell suicide that cancer cells can go through, or any kind of cell can. It reverses the multi-drug resistance, which the MDR that I've highlighted at the body, and works synergistically with chemotherapy. So I suspect that when you look at these are working by similar mechanisms, by targeting similar transporters or pumps in the body. One's on bacteria, the other one's on cancer cells. And so certainly if I was treating someone who's going through chemotherapy, I would look at the research on whatever drug they're on and to see if there's any interactions with milk thistle, and I would probably recommend it. I'd have to think about whether it's appropriate or not, but I wouldn't be discouraged. I would, if the oncologist didn't want the patient taking it, I would definitely try to dig up some research and present it. The big issue that I have with research is, even if there's research out there, the chances of an oncologist reviewing any literature came out in the past few years on natural products is pretty slim, I would imagine. And there may be some oncologists that have a special interest in it, but in general, I don't think they're actually looking at a lot of the evidence. And so there could be some really great evidence that they're just ignoring, and it could take another 20 years before there's enough evidence for someone to do a systematic review to say that there is some benefit of taking milk thistle, and then the policymakers, change what they're doing. But, even right now, like I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned or not, but St. John's Wort's got more than enough evidence that we should be using this as a first-line therapy against depression. But because it's a plant, it's not going to be, there's just a natural prejudice or bias against them. So anyway, so there's one study showing potential benefit of milk thistle, at least in cell cultures. It's not done it's not a huge clinical trial, but it's still compelling research anyways. Here's another study showing golden seal has benefit against Staphylococcus aureus, the MRSA, which is a drug-resistant form. And then moving on, so funguses. An antifungal herb will have an effect against both yeast and fungi. And I'd say one of the most common things that I treat in practice, probably the most common infection that I treat, would be some kind of yeast infection that people experience. And that could be like the same yeast, Candida, for example, that women get when they have vaginal yeast infections. Both men and women get this, and it often just culminates the bowels. And in some people, it's considered to be a natural flora in the guts, but I would say because people are eating a lot of sugar, which helps to feed the yeast, and most people have gone through a round or two of antibiotics, there seems to be a lot more candida growing in people than conventional medicine is aware of. And I've had patients come in with all sorts of weird symptoms, ranging from skin rashes to things like digestive upset, bloating and gas, and various pains, to fibromyalgia-like symptoms or really severe arthritic symptoms with no known good explanation. And when we've tested the person for food sensitivities and also tested them for candida, their candida values are off the chart, so the antibodies are off the chart. And the way that I typically treat these things is I get people to remove yeast and fungi from their diet. So stop eating breads that rise, so you can have things like tortillas and flatbreads. No beer, because beer seems to have a lot of yeast particles. Other liquors like vodka and gin don't seem to be an issue. Red wine is less of an issue than beers. Also avoiding apple ciders and stuff like that. And then I'll give her a round of antimicrobial herbs that have antifungal properties. And the golden seal has this property, so does the myrrh. Also, garlic and various essential oils have a significant effect as antifungals. So the golden seal and the myrrh should be included under these herbs as antifungals as well, but I'm giving you some new ones. Garlic. When it comes to garlic, you could, if you had a vaginal yeast infection, you could literally take a clove of garlic and insert it into the vaginal canal, and this will work to help decrease the infection. And often it's usually recommended attaching a little string to it so it doesn't get lost up there, but and try not to crush it too much, because the sulfur-containing compounds in garlic can be rather caustic and can cause a little bit of pain. But garlic internally is an effective antifungal. And then also garlic externally, if you had something like athlete's foot, if you don't mind the smell of it, you could apply garlic topically. Just crush up a clove of garlic and just rub it on the area, and that'll work as an antifungal as well. Now, if the skin's irritated, it can be very irritating to mucous membranes. So if there's any kind of inflammation, irritation, or open wounds, and it gets into it, it can sting a lot. So just that's one caution. It can also be used for fungal infections in the ear. So crushing up garlic with olive oil is often used for, or at least I use it for, ear infections as well. A variety of herbs like oregano, thyme, eucalyptus, tea tree, those essential oils also have an antifungal effect because they're just a general antiseptic. They just sort of disrupt the cell membranes or cell walls of the fungi. And so both oral and topical essential oils can be used to help fight off infections. And if I'm killing off a candida infection that's in the gut, they can be very stubborn. So I work with the diet first, remove the sugars, remove the yeast and fungi from the diet, give them a tincture of antimicrobials, give them probiotics. The probiotics will help to outcompete them. They'll release some things that'll stimulate the immune system and help to fight off the bugs. And then finally, I might also encapsulate some essential oils and give those to the patient as well. So I've had great results. I've had tons of these cases, but this is a neat case I saw years ago. It might be 10 years ago, but I probably treat yeast infections I would say on a weekly basis, maybe not daily, but probably on a weekly basis for sure. And here was a patient that came in, and she had chronic vaginal yeast infections that began at age 12, and she's now 31. So she's almost 20 years. She had vaginal yeast infections that were unresponsive to the azole antifungals, which include canesten and diflucan. And it was interesting because when she first came into our clinic, the first thing she said to me was, "I think you guys are a bunch of quacks." And I was like, "Oh, okay, why are you here then?" And she said, well, my medical doctor can't help me, and he recommended me to come see you guys. So I said, okay, that's fine. And so at least when someone thinks you're a quack, you really can't get any worse. So you can only go up from there. So I'm happy when people are suspicious or have their doubts that we're going to be able to help them. So in addition to having the vaginal candidiasis, the patient also suffered from bipolar. So she had various mood disorders where she swung from being depressed to being manic. And she also had chronic urinary tract infection of some sort. They called it interstitial cystitis. Nobody knew what it was. She also suffered from some heartburn, and it started when she was a teenager. They treated her with antibiotics to deal with an ulcer, but the heartburn still remained. So what I suspected was going on at this point is that the patient probably had her guts were full of yeast that had some kind of drug resistance against the conditional antifungals. And those antifungals are pretty potent. They can often have a lot of side effects. And so what we did, we gave a few different things. In this case, we gave them echinacea, which is an immunostimulant. Barberry, I prefer to use golden seal because it's better, but we didn't have golden seal at the time, so we used barberry. Also podarca, which I mentioned earlier, it's another antifungal herb. Gentian, which we haven't really talked about, it's another antifungal herb. Clove is Syzygium, it's another antifungal herb. So we gave her a tincture. We also gave her probiotics. We gave her some high potency garlic pills called, I won't mention the name, well, it's already written there. And then we gave her a probiotic and garlic suppository as well. So we targeted both the vaginal area and the guts. And what's neat is if you look at this, the scale that we're using is something called the MIMOP. You don't really need to know that, but 6 is basically the highest. So that's like if you're a scale of 10, we're talking about a 10 out of 10 for severity of symptoms. And so after a couple of weeks of taking this, we saw an immediate relief in the heartburn symptoms. And initially there was a bit of an aggravation of symptoms. Now, one of the things that happened was when you kill off yeast too quickly, it can actually cause something called the Herxheimer reaction and make the situation worse before it gets better, because as you kill off the yeast, they kind of die and liberate all these little yeast particles that your body reacts to. And I think in addition to doing what we told her, she also got one of the, like a yeast buster kit or something, was taking that as well. So I told her to stop that. So after about a month or more of being on the tincture, her symptoms were the best they've been in over 20 years. And then several months later, she went on a few rounds of the tinctures, continued with the probiotics, worked on a diet, and her symptoms that were once a 10 out of 10 were now down at a 0. And her overall well-being, which initially aggravated when we started with the treatment, ended up being at the all-time best. And she said that her moods had stabilized. She felt a million times better. And we resolved her vaginal yeast infection. And also, I suspect the reason why we're successful is because we also targeted the yeast that was in the gut. And when she was taking the conventional antifungals, she was doing it as a suppository, so she never addressed the gut flora, which is important. Now I'm going to answer a bunch of questions shortly. Let me just have a look how many more slides we have in this little section here. So I'll have a quick look at the questions now. Okay, so Michael asked 2 questions, and they're good questions. Would you be concerned about giving an immunostimulant to a patient receiving chemo could potentially interfere with the chemo treatment, or would it target completely areas of the immune system? So I would say I would have, depending on what type of chemotherapy they're taking, if someone had like a lymphoma or some other kind of cancer cell of the immune system, then I would say you'd want to be very careful about giving an immunostimulant under those circumstances, because the chemotherapy is specifically trying to kill off some kind of blood cell that's, and that is a type of cancer. So in that case, yes, you would be very careful. That would also include drugs that are given, like cyclosporins or cephalosporins, that are used to treat certain types of autoimmune conditions. So if someone's on immunosuppressant drugs, taking an immunomodulator or immunostimulant would be contraindicated. If someone's taking something like cisplatin, which is basically a chemotherapeutic drug that generates all these free radicals and just kind of, it's like dropping a bomb in the body and kind of kills everything, then I wouldn't be worried about giving an immunomodulator or an immunostimulant to those patients, because in fact, in those cases, it would be better for them. The other question Michael had, what are your thoughts on oregano oil as a first-line defense for viral infections? I find that it is a go-to for many people and seems to be very popular. Oregano oil, it's not my first choice. It's, to me, I think it's a good choice, but it doesn't have immunostimulating properties. It basically, the way that the oregano oil works is it disrupts the cell membranes and sort of makes the viruses more vulnerable. So we recommend it at our clinic. I use it, and it's pretty potent stuff. So the one thing about it is when you take an essential oil in orally, it'll kind of go around and circulate through the body, and then it gets released in the lungs. So it does have an affinity for the lungs. So it's good, but it's not the only thing I recommend. I do like giving someone some kind of immunostimulant along with it. And there are other herbs that are better antivirals that we'll talk about shortly. So someone's looking at my little graph here, and they're saying, that's a good point. Grisharan said on the chart that the yellow line shows her well-being was decreasing. Is that correct? Yeah, that should just mean it's actually the opposite. In that case, it's like 0 for some reason on this thing means you're happy because you don't have anything bothering you. So I don't like the MyMop. We've moved away from using that. We used to do this in the clinic. So 0 is good and 6 is bad, which is counterintuitive. And the scale of using a 6 instead of a 10 scale is stupid as well. I mean, there's reason why researchers use that, but I don't agree with it. Anyways, we used it for a period of time. I abandoned that type of scale. So yes, good point there. Okay, so it's 10:30 just about. Any more questions? Otherwise, we'll take a quick little break and then finish off the antimicrobial section. So any more questions? Okay, so let's come back at 10:40. We'll be back and hopefully we'll finish all the immune system and anti-infection system, and then we might be able to get to the urinary tract as well, okay? So we'll be back in 10 minutes. If you have any questions, just add them to the list, okay? Okay, so we all good here? We got sound back on. You want to just send me a quick text to make sure that everything's in the question thing. Just say, yep, sounds good. It's working again. Good, good. Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Uh, Moving on. So when it comes to treating infections, viruses are a big nuisance, and I think there's a lot of great herbal products that can help with treating colds and flus and other chronic viral infections. So it could be anything from an upper respiratory tract infection. It could be some kind of viral hepatitis like Hep A or B or C. Um, it could be mono. There's so many different ones. Um, Now, with regards to the research, I don't know which herbs are the best herbs to use for a particular um, viral infection, but there's lots of research showing some of them work better for RNA viruses, some of them don't work for the DNA viruses. Um, so you kind of have to look at the monographs to figure out which would be the best herbs for that. Now, in general, as we mentioned, herbs that are rich in essential oils can have an antiviral effect. So things like oregano oil, they'll just disrupt the cell membranes of the viruses and make them a little bit more vulnerable to the immune system. And then there's a number of other herbs that work as antivirals, and it may be because they work as an immunostimulant, and maybe that's how they work as an antiviral, or maybe they'll directly target some kind of protein that the viruses make, or they may prevent the binding of the viruses to our cells, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, licorice is a great herb used in Chinese medicine and Western herbalism for lots and lots of different purposes. It's one of my favorite herbs. I use it frequently. With regards to viral infections, there's a number of studies that show benefit for licorice against numerous infections, viral infections, including SARS and influenza. So I always use it in some kind of cold and flu formula, whether it's a tea or it's a tincture. Endographis, it's a great herb used in Ayurvedic medicine and also in Chinese medicine. When I was a student, we didn't really know much about it, and it's made its way into traditional Western naturopathic medicine now. You'll see lots of products on the market that contain endographis, and it's, again, another broad-acting antimicrobial that does have some antiviral properties. Also, some of the immunostimulants and immunomodulators we discussed earlier on, like Siberian ginseng, it seems to work well on a number of RNA viruses which are involved with like influenza, but it doesn't work for the DNA viruses that are responsible for cold sores and the adenovirus. So the reason why I'm showing you this is just to appreciate the fact that there seems to be a benefit of some herbs against certain types of viruses, not other ones. Usually when I give herbal tinctures or formulas, I'm usually combining a few different herbs in there just to make certain that if the main herb doesn't work, then we might have some backup herbs that work. Here's the one little study done a while ago on glycyrrhizin and its effect on the SARS virus, and it seemed to work better than a lot of traditional drugs that were used as antivirals. Now, another important action related to fighting off infections is the anti-adherence action. Now, what this means is that these herbs don't kill the virus or the bacteria directly, but rather they inhibit the binding of the virus or the bacteria to our cells, and that just means that they can't bind and they can't infect us, so they kind of just get washed out of the system. And this action is used for a couple different types of infections. One is used primarily for urinary tract infections. So when you think about herbs like cranberries, they are used for urinary tract infections. And for certain types of bacteria, they bind to their feet or their little hands and prevent them from binding. It can also be used for colds and flus, so upper respiratory tract infections. Certain herbs like elderberries have been used to treat these historically, and it appears it has a similar action that cranberries have, but it targets viruses and viral adhesion to our mucous membranes. Also, some of these various flavonoids and sugars that have an anti-adherence property against urinary tract and respiratory tract infections might also inhibit the binding of things like H. pylori from sticking to our stomach walls and initiating the infections that can cause stomach ulcers. So cranberries are displayed on the left-hand side. It's a cousin of blueberry. Both blueberries and cranberries have the same genus, Vaccinium. The cranberries, and there's a few different types of blueberries and bilberries out there. Both of them seem to have activity and help to have a protective effect against urinary tract infections. They have similar phytochemicals in them. Cranberries have that red color to their berries, while blueberries are obviously more blue. But what's interesting is that phytochemical, it's essentially the same thing in both cranberries and blueberries, but because cranberries are more acidic, it changes the way these anthocyanins express themselves, and so it's more red in color. And if you alkalinize cranberry juice, it'll become more blue or purple in color. Elderberry and elderflowers, there's two different varieties. There's one that grows in Canada, which is Zambucus canadensis. There's one that grows in Europe, which is Zambucus nigra. Both of them have been researched as for colds and flus. Both the flowers and the berries have properties associated with them, and they're definitely useful. So the way that I think these herbs have their exhibit their anti-adherence properties is back to that bacteria we had before there, the little octopus-like one. And a lot of these bacteria have little suction cups, or rather adhesion proteins, that target certain receptors on the mucous membranes in our respiratory tract or urinary tract. And when they grab a hold of it, that means now they can basically attack the mucous membranes in the cells. So if they can't attach, then they can't attack. So this just helps to flush these guys out of the system. Various carbohydrates, condensed tannins, some hydrolyzable tannins will have this effect. So there are many herbs and phytochemicals that have this property. What's interesting also, as we mentioned before, E. coli, we know, are susceptible to these. So is Helicobacter pylori, which causes stomach ulcers. Also Campylobacter jejuni, which is also one that causes severe gastrointestinal infections. And also a particular bacteria that targets, that has an effect and causes gingivitis in the mouth. So drinking cranberry juice, not only does it help with urinary tract infections, but it may help with gastrointestinal and also gingivitis. Now, one thing worth mentioning is that these compounds don't seem to have any effect on yeast or candida colonization in the gut. So you wouldn't use these for a yeast infection. So cranberry juice, it might work for urinary tract infection caused by a bacteria like E. coli, but won't work for yeast infections, and it won't work for other types of bacteria as well. Now, with regards to viruses, with the influenza virus, it has little surface proteins called hemagglutinin, and it will bind to receptors on the surface of the mucous membranes. And what I think elderberry does, there may be carbohydrates, and there's also anthocyanins, which are responsible for the blue color. These are various flavonoids. They'll stick to the surface and prevent these influenza viruses sticking to the cells. So it's just another little reminder. So elderberries and cranberries both do this. I don't know if cranberries are effective against influenza, though. It may not be effective for that. Here's a couple studies just quickly to talk about Zambucus, so elderflower and elderberry binding to influenza and H1N1 viruses. Now, another action is an antiparasitic action. This is a broad term. A parasite can refer to a number of different types of infections. Sometimes naturopaths and other natural therapies will use the term parasites in a very ambiguous way. They'll say, oh, you've got a parasite inside your gut. I think when someone says parasite in that way, I prefer using the term dysbiosis, meaning your gut flora is upset. I think I mean, it's probably just as ambiguous, but it doesn't necessarily imply that you have a parasite like some kind of worm or an amoeba or one of these, or malaria or something like that. So when it comes to antiparasitic herbs, there's a bunch of herbs that have this action. And it can be broken down into more specific terms. So an anthelmintic, what this means is it basically helps to destroy worms. So a helminth is a worm. So pinworms, hookworms, tapeworms are all different types of helminths. They're not bacteria or viruses, they're a type of parasite. And so anthelmintic, it also means anti-helminth would be more accurate. They just sort of combined it and got rid of the I. I don't know why they did that, but so it's anti-helminth. Anti-helminth would be the other sort of way of using the term. And some related actions to this are vermifuge and vermicidal herbs. So a vermifuge, it just stuns a worm. It doesn't actually kill it, just sort of knocks it out so it kind of gets flushed through the system. And then a vermicide is a type of anthelmintic herb that actually kills it. Now, many of these herbs that target worms can be quite toxic to humans as well and need to be used responsibly. I've never, no, I think I've treated worm infections. Often, if it's a severe infection, I might try the herbs, but there are lots of drugs that might also be effective for these as well. When it comes to herbs, wormwood is like the archetypal herb used for parasites. Obviously, from the name of it, it was used for various types of worm infections, and also tansy. So they're both in the same family. They're both in the aster family, same family that feverfew's in. Wormwood on the left, it was used originally to make absinthe, which is a type of liquor that was used and drunk in high amounts by the Impressionists, and it does contain a neurotoxin called thuyon, which you really have to be careful with in high amounts, especially if you're pregnant. And then tansy on the right-hand side is another herb that's been used historically for various worm infections. You don't see this being used often in herbal medicine. It grows wild around here. Often we'll see it in ditches and on hiking trails. I haven't used this herb very much just because in North America we don't treat worm infections that often. I might use wormwood in various formulas because wormwood can also be used for yeast, bacteria, and other types of infections. But because tansy can have a little more severe side effects, I tend not to use it as much. Now, another type of parasite is a protozoa. And when it comes to protozoas, when you think about things like malaria, giardia, amoebic dysentery, leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, and trichomonas, or like a type of vaginosis or vaginitis, those are all different types of protozoa. A lot of the herbs we've already mentioned, like golden seal and myrrh, but also black walnut. I've seen all these have shown exhibited some kind of anti-protozoal activity. I know that golden seal is not a primary herb used for malaria, but there are some studies showing that berberine has anti-malarial properties. And it's not really that surprising because it contains isoquinolines, which are structurally very similar to the quinoline alkaloids that you'll find in drugs like chloroquines. Golden seal and myrrh also have some activity against things like giardia, trichomonas infections as well. So again, when I give someone a tincture, I might give them golden seal, myrrh, podarco, and wormwood might be a formula that I use. And I select it because it has 4 different classes of phytochemicals in it that have broad-acting antibacterial, antifungal, antiprotozoal effects, and it works pretty good. I don't know which herb is working, but often I use the same formula for most types of infections, and I get pretty good results. I will tweak it a little bit depending on if I'm treating. If I think it's viral, I may not use that one, but if I think it's bacterial or yeast or possibly a parasite, I use very similar formulas and just tweak them a little bit. There's black walnut on the left-hand side. It's like the North American equivalent to Podarco. The phytochemicals in it are very similar to what you get in Podarco. And Podarco grows, as I mentioned, in Latin America, while black walnut grows more up in North America. So here's just a study showing that myrrh has some anti-parasitic effects against trichomonas infections, a type of vaginal infections. Here's another study talking about how berberine has activity against it. Again, berberine has some benefit against trichomonas and giardia, two types of amoebas. So the naphthoquinone compounds in black walnut and in Podarco have some activity against this particular drug. I forget what this is, or this particular infection. Just some parasite. It's a tropical parasite. I can't remember what it is. Now, when it comes to malaria, you probably will never treat malaria. And if I got malaria, because it's so, it's a very severe infection, and people die from it. So if I actually contracted malaria, I would probably go with the conventional drug regime before going into the herbs, just because it's much more established and everything else. But the herbs do work, and it's what they were used historically for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, by indigenous people. So two herbs that we've talked about maybe briefly already, at least one of them we have, sweet wormwood. This is the Chinese wormwood, and it's been used, as I mentioned, in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. It's been documented. And the way that it works is it contains a compound called the sesquiterpene lactone, and it's a peroxide of these. Now, if you look at the structure in the bottom, just as an aside, the sesquiterpene lactones and these various terms, we're going to discuss them more after the midterm when we're talking about the phytochemistry, but I'm just sort of mentioning some of these in passing, so just for repetition's sake. So this particular compound contains that peroxide bridge. Now, if you look at it, that O oxygen molecule attached to an oxygen, that's a peroxide. And this is a relatively unstable chemical bond. And so what happens is when malaria take that up, the heme, because if you know anything about malaria infects red blood cells. And when they do that, they basically help to break down the hemoglobin, and it liberates free heme. And free heme contains an iron molecule. And one of the things that happens when iron comes in contact with peroxide, with this peroxide molecule or hydrogen peroxide, it'll generate free radicals. And in the case of the malaria parasite, these free radicals have the destructive effect, and this molecule also can then react with other structures and cause some damage. And so there's a couple different mechanisms that it works. Is one, it generates the free radicals. Two, this molecule can then basically bind to proteins in DNA and cause some issues. Now, just as an aside, one thing that's interesting is in Chinese medicine, they always said that the best way to do the extraction with this herb is to do a cold water extraction. So maybe make a little bit of, warm the water up a bit and infuse the plant in it. But they basically said don't boil it and boil the herb in high temperature for a long period of time, because these peroxide bridges that are on the artemisinin molecule is the main active group, and if you were to boil it, it's also it's unstable in a high temperature reaction, so that bridge will break apart and make the chemical ineffective. So what's interesting is there was a couple studies done by drug companies that basically showed that the herb was ineffective when you boil it, make it as a tea. And so therefore, people shouldn't grow the herb themselves and take it, but rather they should just buy the drugs from them and use them because they've been established to be effective. And when you think about it, if they were boiling the herbs for a period of time, it is going to make it ineffective because it's going to destroy it. So not that I would ever use this. I probably would go with the drugs just for legal reasons and everything else. If I were to use this as a plant, you just got to remember that you could use it as a tincture, but also to not boil it because it's heat sensitive. Here's a little discussion about how peroxides generate free radicals in the presence of iron molecules called the Fenton reaction, but I'll skip over that now. So here's a little diagram. We'll come back to this in a second. I just like understanding how things work, even though you're never probably going to treat malaria. It's just for interest's sake. This is how herbs can have their effects. You've got hemoglobin, which is safe in a red blood cell and relatively stable. When the malaria parasite infects the red blood cell, it takes the hemoglobin and temporarily releases free heme, which then becomes very toxic and very reactive. And so the malaria has an enzyme called heme polymerase, which forms crystals or polymers out of the free heme to stabilize it and make it safe. Because otherwise, if the heme molecule gets to a really high level in the cells, it'll have a destructive effect. So one of the ways that the artemisinin molecule works is it directly interacts with the heme molecule where the iron group is in the middle, and that causes a Fenton reaction, which generates a free radical or hydroxyl radical on the artemisinin molecule. And so now this artemisinin molecule, one, it's generated free radicals, some kind of chain reaction inside the cell. Two, this compound, this artemisinin radical, is now a reactive compound that can bind to proteins of DNA. Now we'll talk about quinine in a second, or I guess maybe this is now how we're going to talk about it. Quinine was one of the original anti-malarial compounds, and it comes from chinchonum bar. And when you drink something like tonic water contains quinine. And quinine is a quinoline alkaloid, unlike berberine, which is an isoquinoline alkaloid. So they're similar in structure, just they vary a little bit where the nitrogen is placed on the double ring structure, and a few other things that are different. But anyways, what's neat about the quinine molecule is it has a different enzyme and a different place at a target. So the quinine basically inhibits the heme polymerase enzyme that's responsible for generating the safe hemozoin. So under this circumstance, quinine basically increases the amount of free heme inside the cell, while the artemisinin reacts directly with the free heme. So combining them, and most people taking artemisinin now, it's used in combination with other compounds like quinine or quinoline-like compounds to decrease the drug resistance with the artemisinin. And I would say just structurally, if you look at the quinine, because it's similar to the berberine, and because there's a lot of drug resistance to it, I wonder what would happen if you gave quinine with the artemisinin and combined it with some of these flavonolignin that inhibit the multi-drug resistant pumps. So I think you probably have more effective drugs that way. There are some insecticides. We don't use these very often. When it comes to insects, there are things like feverfew. There's partheniums compounds. I forget what they're called. Not quite called partheniums, but there's various compounds from feverfew-like compounds that are used to kill off spiders. So it's a natural, quote-unquote, spider spray or insecticide. Also, some people use essential oils topically for lice or scabies. There are drugs that are used. So I don't know if this is an important action, but there are herbs that might be classified under this, but it's just not commonly seen. Now, moving on to the next system, the respiratory tract. A lot of the herbs that we've mentioned already will be used for respiratory tract infection, but in addition, there are certain actions associated with the respiratory tract that can be used to for numerous conditions and not just infections. So in old herbal textbooks, catarrh refers to inflammation of the mucous membranes, and this causes the production of a lot of mucus and phlegm. Now, catarrh can be in the respiratory tract, so if someone has a bad infection and they have a lot of respiratory catarrh, that means lots of phlegm, lots of mucus, lots of hacking going on. Everything's inflamed and irritated. You can also have catarrh in the gastrointestinal tract, so someone had some kind of infection where they're producing a lot of mucus, blood, there's a lot of pain, and that would be a gastrointestinal catarrh. And it can also be like for urinary tract infections, lots of mucus and irritation and inflammation as well. So catarrh occurs to lots of different systems in the body. With regards to the respiratory tract, it usually refers to things like bronchitis and pneumonia, but other types of upper respiratory tract infections as well. Some colds and flus will have that. Excuse me. This term may or may not be used. It's kind of an older term, but when something's an anti-catarrhal, it just means that it's helped to treat conditions with lots of inflammation and mucus of those inflammation and mucus production in the mucous membranes. Now, decongestants refers to something that helps to decrease nasal congestion. Now, what happens when you get a stuffy nose? If you've ever noticed that you might feel all congested and you try to blow your nose but nothing comes out, and you keep blowing really, really hard and you just can't blow out that congestion. And that's because when you have a cold, there could be two things going on. One, there could be actual phlegm or mucus in the nose that's bothering you. And two, you can actually have edema inside the sinuses and the nasal passageways. And so what happens is when something irritates the mucous membranes, histamine gets released that then makes the capillaries leakier. And so a lot of the water will flow out of the capillaries into the interstitial space and cause a bogginess and inflammation there. So when you're feeling all congested but there's no mucus or no quote-unquote snot, it's not necessarily that you can't blow it out. It's all just, it's like a inflammation, edema, swelling in there, and it's inside this, or it's around the cells, not inside the cavity, so you can't blow it out. So some of the treatments for this would be to take a herb that has a decongestant effect, and you might use this for some kind of respiratory tract infection or for sinusitis. You could also use it for allergic rhinitis. That would be another indication. Now, one of the conventional drugs that are used for this are either antihistamines or using some kind of sympathomimetic, something that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. And the way that an antihistamine works is there are a number of flavonoids or herbs, for example, vitamin C and quercetin have an antihistamine effect. So you might take that when someone has a lot of sinus congestion, and it just kind of helps to relieve the symptoms. It may not speed up the recovery, but if someone has seasonal allergies, giving them something like an antihistamine would help with that. The second thing, if you take something like ephedra, as we mentioned earlier on, it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. And one of the actions for that is it causes vasoconstriction in the capillaries and the arteries that supply blood to the nose. And so as a result, when you cause a little bit of vasoconstriction, it makes the capillaries less leaky and less fluid flows into the space in between the cells. And so you get less of this interstitial edema going on. And so it helps to dry up the nose. So if you were to take ephedra, if you were to take it as a tincture, the main effects would be is it would open up the bronchioles. It would have a decongestant effect in the sinuses, but the side effects would include increasing heart rate and increasing blood pressure. It might cause a little bit of agitation, decrease in appetite because of the effects that it has on the sympathetic nervous system. So ephedra is useful for respiratory tract infections and allergies, but it has to be used with caution because of the effects on the cardiovascular system. It's not very specific. So I would probably, I don't usually give it alone. Now, if you look at a lot of cold and sinus medication and some medication for allergies, ephedrine or pseudoephedrine is the active ingredient, and that comes from the plant ephedra, or originally came from that. Now, there are other herbs that act as bronchodilators, and where you would use this is if there's bronchoconstriction going on, meaning the airways were narrow and you're having difficulty breathing. This could occur with allergies, asthma, also with some type of infection. You could take a herb internally to have a bronchodilating effect. Now, two of the most potent herbs that have this action are things like ephedra and Jimson weed. Now, ephedra, there is safety concerns with this, and it's sometimes difficult to find, but certainly you can get it over the counter if you go to the drugstore in the form of ephedrine. Jimson weed is also referred to as devil's trumpet or datura, and this herb has historically been used. It's mixed with some other herbs, including mullein, and sometimes smoked in a pipe, and it has a bronchodilating effect. Now, Jimson weed is called an anticholinergic. It's a pretty potent drug that, unlike ephedra, that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. What Jimson weed does is it suppresses the parasympathetic nervous system, and thereby has a very similar effects on the body. So if you stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, you'll have bronchodilation, or you can suppress the parasympathetic nervous system and have the same sort of effect. So Jimson weed is not a herb that I've used in practice, but culturally and certainly in the herbal textbooks, it has been used for this. There's just a lot of safety concerns with this. So, and generally speaking, I don't get my patients to smoke herbs. So internally, it would cause a number of other symptoms, including dry mouth and constipation and suppressed digestion. So it's not selective enough. Now, in the pharmaceutical world, both herbs like ephedra and the active ingredients in Jimson weed are found in a lot of puffers used for asthma and COPD and other respiratory conditions. Now, an antispasmodic herb could also be referred to as a spasmolytic. So in Latin, lysis or lytic means to break apart. So spasmolytic means something that helps to relieve or break apart spasms. And these herbs can be used anywhere where there's mucous or smooth muscles. And so if you think about it, generally speaking, there's a lot of smooth muscles in the gastrointestinal tract. So if someone has a lot of cramping pains associated with, let's say, severe diarrhea or constipation where the smooth muscles are cramping up because the peristalsis isn't quite working in a normal way, it's sort of cramping up. Also, you might get somebody with a gallbladder cramping going on, and you might use a spasmolytic effect for that. Now, with regards to the respiratory system, if someone has a really bad cough where it becomes, there's a lot of constriction, or they're coughing a lot, there's a lot of the spasmodic cough, like whooping cough or croup. Also with asthma, sometimes there's irritation and the smooth muscles in the respiratory tract will start to cramp up a bit. Then you would use herbs that have this sort of action. And this also is related, I would say, to herbs that have a bronchodilating effect. So herbs like ephedra that we've already mentioned, and also the Jimson weed would have an antispasmodic effect. Other herbs that are a little more gentle, things like horehound, thyme, red clover, those are also herbs that probably have some bronchodilating effects. They're relatively safe to use, maybe not as effective as the ephedra and the Jimson weed, not as potent a drug, but certainly a lot safer. So as I mentioned, ephedra, it's used to stimulate sympathetic nervous systems, decongestant, bronchodilator. It's a stimulant, antispasmodic, can be used for allergies, and it also can induce sweating, and that's what diaphoretic is. We'll get to that shortly. These are some general actions of thyme. So thyme, not thyme oil. Thyme oil will have an antiseptic effect and antimicrobial effect, but I don't know if you get some of the antispasmodic and antitussive properties associated with just the oil. I know that there's flavonoids in the whole herb that has beneficial effects. So I sometimes will use oregano and thyme oil by itself, but I often will include thyme in respiratory formulas. In particular, it has a certain affinity for spasmodic coughs. So usually I think of peppermint as being a good herb for digestive cramping, and I think of thyme as being a good herb for respiratory cramping. You could use them interchangeably for either system, but I find this has according to the old herbal textbooks, a good affinity for the respiratory tract. So an anti-allergic action would be some herb that helps to treat seasonal allergies, sinusitis, rhinitis would be the main indication. A couple of my favorite herbs for this are eyebright. Now, eyebright's shown on the left-hand side. What's funny about this herb is it's really difficult to see. It only is a few centimeters in height. And for years, I've been looking for it in the wild because I know it grows in North America. And I could never find it. And finally, when someone showed it to me, I was at a herb garden. It's only a few centimeters tall. I thought it was like a foot or two tall. And so it's really, really tiny. So this photograph that I took here on the left is down with 180 millimeter macro lens. It's a big macro lens in order to zoom in on it. So it's a pretty little plant. And eyebright has a particular affinity for the eyes, hence the name. And so when people get seasonal allergies, they tend to get itchy, watery eyes, also sinus congestion. So I will use eyebright and combine it with other herbs like stinging nettle. And stinging nettle as a herb, the leaf and the roots are used. It's a very benign herb once it's dried. And it has some phytochemicals that appear to have beneficial effects against seasonal allergies. And I've had people, I usually recommend vitamin C and quercetin in supplement form. And then I often will make a tea or a tincture with eyebright, stinging nettle, and there's a couple other things I sometimes throw into it as well, like rosemary and sometimes an adaptogen. And it doesn't miraculously make everything go away instantly. It usually, after a couple days, it sort of helps to modulate the immune system and decrease the severity of symptoms by about 50% or more. So, and that's sometimes all that somebody needs. Now, another action that's often associated with the respiratory tract is the diaphoretic action. And this is something that stimulates sweating. And so the belief with a lot of herbs that can help stimulate sweating is it's kind of like when you sweat out a cold. So diaphoretic herbs are often given to sort of help people warms up their core and stimulate sweating. And the belief is that somehow affects the immune system and helps to sweat out the cold. It may be that when you take a diaphoretic that you're stimulating some kind of a part of the immune system that then works better for treating, let's say, viral infections. Or maybe it's unrelated to the sweating, it's some other phytochemical in there. So I know that, for example, elderflowers, we've already shown that they have an anti-adherence property. But if you drink elderflower tea, not so much with the berries, more with the actual flowers, it induces a lot of sweating. And I've taken it numerous times for colds, and I find that I end up sweating more than usual. So if I take it and I'm working, usually I have to put on some antiperspirant, otherwise I'm sweating through my dress shirts. So elderflower is a great herb for inducing a sweat. Cayenne is another one where often cayenne is given internally and small amounts. You might do this, let's say, add it to a soup like sweet and sour soup or spicy food. Often it acts as a decongestant as well, cayenne does, and stimulates sweating. And sure everyone here knows that if you eat a lot of spicy food, you'll start feeling a little bit warmer. It warms up your circulation, might make you sweat, and certainly you might start coughing up a little bit of phlegm because it makes your increases the excretion of various fluids in the respiratory tract. And then finally, ephedra, because it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, one of the other actions that it has is it has that stimulatory effect on sweating. Now, I don't know if ephedra has a beneficial effect on immune function or not. I think it probably has more of a suppressive effect, but these are some diaphoretic herbs. Now, in Latin or Greek, a tuss, Tuss, refers to a cough. So an antitussive is a herb that helps to relieve coughing. Now, it may or may not act as a cough suppressant. We'll talk to that in a second. It could either help support the coughing function or help protect the mucous membranes in some sort of way, or it might directly suppress the cough. Now, there are two main types of coughs that you can have, a dry cough or a wet cough. And so a dry cough is more like an irritating, when there's inflammation of the respiratory tract, and when you cough, you're not able to clear anything from the lungs. It's not like there's a lot of mucus that you're trying to clear. It's more of an irritation to the respiratory tract. While a wet cough is when there's a lot of chunky phlegm rattling around in the chest, and you're trying to wheeze and cough it up, and you can hear it. It's in there, but it might be kind of stuck in there. And so both of these types of coughs, you might use an antitussive herb for that. So herbs like mullein, coltsfoot are generally used for dry coughs, but they can be used for wet coughs as well. Wild black cherry bark is a cough suppressant. So anything if it's a cough suppressant, it'll also be an antitussive as well. The opium poppy, which we don't use anymore herbally because of all the addictive properties to it, but historically it was used as a cough suppressant because of the opiates. So a couple main cough suppressants that I would say the archetypal cough suppressant herb that we still use in herbal medicine is wild black cherry bark, and it contains cyanogenic glycosides that inhibit the cough reflex. And so it's used more when you have a dry cough where you're not actually trying to cough anything up. Now, when it comes to the health in general, if you think about it, when somebody gets a cough, usually they're trying to clear bacteria and dead white blood cells from the respiratory tract, so they're not lingering around, and you're trying to get all that garbage out of the lungs. Same thing if you get an infection in the gastrointestinal tract. When you get like traveler's diarrhea, that diarrhea is usually beneficial because you're helping to flush out the bugs that are causing the problem. Now, so in an ideal world, you don't really want to suppress a cough, and you don't really want to suppress diarrhea. You want to work with the body as much as possible and try to support that sort of reflex. However, in some cases, if you might need to suppress the cough reflex because the person may not be sleeping, or they may be coughing like in fits and causing further exhaustion, or sometimes people could even break a rib because they're coughing so hard. So there is a place to suppress it. Generally speaking, I want to work with the cough and give certain herbs that help to increase mucus production and help to flush out what's there. But if someone's coughing at night and they can't fall asleep, then there's nothing wrong with giving a cough suppressant. As I mentioned before, wild cherry bark, it's a common one used. I think it works okay. Opium poppy definitely will work better, but we're not allowed to use it. And then finally, this is chocolate or cacao. Oh, actually, I forgot to put these slides in. As I mentioned, wild cherry bark, it contains cyanogenic glycosides. This is cyanide-containing phytochemicals that when cyanide gets released in small amounts, as everyone knows, cyanide is very dangerous, but in small amounts, it inhibits a chemoreceptor in the phrenic nerve, and that suppresses the cough reflex. So if someone needs to sleep, or they're trying to sit in a classroom and they have these coughing fits and they can't stop, you could use a herb like this for that action. Like I said, opium's a great cough suppressant. There are opioid drugs that are now used that interact with opioid receptors that are often used to suppress cough. So a lot of cough medication contains these compounds. And they tend to have less addictive effects too. So anyways, this is a controlled substance. You don't want to use it, but it has been used historically to suppress smooth muscle function and also the cough reflex. Now finally, this is what I was going to tell you. Cacao or chocolate has not been used historically as a cough suppressant. But what's really neat about this is I saw a small journal research study done in 2004 that found that theobromine, which is a compound related to caffeine, was shown a 50-gram chocolate bar was as effective as opiates for suppressing the cough reflex. And now what I like about this is 90% chocolate. Not only is it safe, doesn't have any side effects, but it tastes good and it has other health benefits. So I've used this a couple times or a few times on patients. It doesn't work every single time, but it has been. It's a nice little thing to be able to recommend someone, because often in practice I kind of get tired of saying, oh, here's another bottle of pills you can take, or another tincture, or another tea. So I like to give them options. And so if someone has a bad cough when they come in, or it's a chronic cough that's dry and it's bugging them, I'll tell them, pick up some 90% dark chocolate and just nibble away with it, a few pieces, until the cough stops. And to give you one little story, which I thought was kind of neat, is I told my dad about this study a few years ago, and just because it's sort of interesting, and they were away on holiday somewhere, and he got a really bad viral infection. And then finally, when it resolved, he ended up getting one of those really dry, irritating coughs. So he was feeling better, but he'd start coughing, and then he wouldn't be able to stop coughing. And there was no phlegm to clear. It was just more like the airways were inflamed and irritated and dry. And he woke up in the middle of the night at, I think, 2 a.m. and couldn't stop coughing. And so he got in the car to try to find a drugstore that was open. He couldn't find anything that was open. The only thing that was open was a 24-hour gas station. So he picked up a dark chocolate bar and started chewing on it. And he said within a few minutes, finally the cough resolved, and he said he was able to go back to sleep. So I just think it's just kind of neat that chocolate has that indication. Now, the study also looked at, just as an aside, theobromine, which is in chocolate. There's other things like theophylline and caffeine, which are in tea and coffee, and it was shown to be ineffective as a cough suppressant. So only the chocolate. So coffee and tea won't have that beneficial effect. Now, I saw a little question pop up here. I'm going to just stop for 1 second and see if it's relevant. Michael's asking, I can't get my questions any bigger. Why is that? It's really annoying. Just 1 second. I'm going to see if I can get it back. So Michael's just asking if I can give an example of a exam question. So an exam question for something like this, let's say it might be, if I give it a question on cough suppressants and antitussives, I might say something like, a patient comes in and they're having really bad cough and it's keeping them up at night. Which of the following actions would you use to help relieve the symptoms? Would you do A, an antitussive, B, an anti-allergic, C, a antiseptic, or D, a bronchodilator? So what would be the best action to use? And you'd be like, oh, it's the antitussive. Or another thing I might say is, which of the following herbs is known to have a cough suppressant effect? A, is it nettles? B, is it wild cherry bark? C, is it, I forget what else I've talked about today. Artemisinin, or Chinese wormwood, or D, is it elderflower? So that's would be an example. So I might ask, which of the following herbs have this action? Or I might say, uh, here's a presentation of a patient, something's going on. Which of the following actions or which of the following combination of actions would be best suited for this person? So if someone comes in with a cold, I might say, which of the following combinations would be good for this patient to take: an immunostimulant, an antitussive, a bronchodilator, and a antimicrobial, or whatever it may be. Okay. Let's go back to the presentation. So one of my favorite actions is the demulcent action. And typically demulcents are used in the lungs, in the gastrointestinal tract, and also to some degree in the urinary tract. And demulcents basically are used to help protect the mucous membranes from irritation or help to reduce the inflammation. And most demulcents, they can work by two different mechanisms. One, they can supplement the body with soluble fiber. And when you add soluble fiber to water, it forms a viscous consistency, kind of slime basically is what fiber forms. And it's like you're supplementing your body with mucus. And so if you were to take certain herbs like marshmallow, the herb, or slippery elm, it's really, really high in fiber. And so you drink it maybe to help coat your esophagus, and it has a nice soothing effect on the mucous membrane. So one, you either drink it and directly coat your mucous membranes to have the effect, or two, you take a herb that contains some other phytochemical that stimulates your body to make more mucus, or produces the secretion of fluids, so you're making a little bit more mucus. Now, one of the things that happens is if you've got like dry, irritated lungs and you take a demulcent, it'll stimulate the mucus production to kind of coat them and decrease the inflammation. And that's nice, a nice sort of soothing effect. Also, demulcents worked as expectorants, and if you've got some mucus sticking in your lungs and you take a demulcent, it could actually increase the mucus production and help you cough out some of the phlegm. We'll talk about that in a second. So the main indication for demulcents, it would be for a sore throat, or if someone had laryngitis, so down a little bit further down, and you wanted to sort of coat it and have a protective effect. And you can also use it for a dry cough. Now, certain herbs like mullein and colt's foot, they do have fiber in it. And if you gather the plants, here's mullein on the left and here's colt's foot on the right. Both of these herbs do have fiber in it. So if you were to mix it in water, it would form a little bit of a viscous, a little bit of a slimy consistency. But I suspect that the way they exert their effects on the lungs is, I know that mullein has a phytochemical that stimulates mucus production by inhibiting certain enzymes involved with mucus production, or with mucus production. So it has this, tells your body to make mucus, and it also has a little bit of mucilage that helps to coat your mucous membranes directly and indirectly. Now, I don't know if I mentioned, yeah, licorice does the same thing. So I know that licorice has this effect of increasing or stimulating mucus production in both the gastrointestinal tract and also in the respiratory tract. And I suspect there's less research on mullein and colt's foot, but I know that they both have that effect as well. Now, an expectorant may or may not be related to the demulcents. So an expectorant is a herb that helps to facilitate the expulsion or the removal of phlegm from the lungs. And there's a few different ways that it can do that. In general, an expectorant is used for wet coughs, things like bronchitis or asthma, to kind of help to clear things and decrease the congestion inside the airways. And so a couple of ways that an expectorant works is, one, if you were to take a demulcent herb, like we've mentioned already, um, because of demulcent, some of them like licorice and also coltsfoot and mullein, they will stimulate a little bit of mucus production by affecting some enzyme that's involved in that, involved in the making of certain prostaglandin. So they can work on that way. So most, or I'd say all demulcents will have some expectorant effect, but then there are also herbs that have an expectorant effect through a different mechanism. And so Indian tobacco, for example, lobelia, the way it works as an expectorant is it stimulates a receptor in the central nervous system that's involved in the nausea and vomiting reflex. And so in small amounts, what happens, if you've ever actually, I'm sure everyone out there has vomited at some point in their life, if you've ever noticed right before you vomit, often you'll start getting this weird saliva starts to form. You start salivating a whole bunch and you start swallowing. You're like, ooh, something doesn't feel right. And then a few minutes later, you'll start to vomit. And so probably part of the vomiting reflex is it stimulates mucus production to coat the intestinal tract or the esophagus, which isn't designed to handle really bad stomach acid. So it protects it so when you do vomit, the stomach acid doesn't go and burn holes in your esophagus and stuff. And so increasing mucus production usually occurs before you actually vomit. Now, certain herbs that act as expectorant, like the Indian tobacco, it'll actually target these receptors. And so a little bit will basically get the mucus flowing to help you to protect the mucous membranes. And so when you produce more mucus, what it does is it helps to thin and water down the phlegm that's stuck in the lungs so you can cough it up better. And so Indian tobacco is an example of a herb that's used for that. But if you take too much of the Indian tobacco, it'll cause vomiting. And so another term for Indian tobacco is puke weed. So puke meaning vomit weed. Because low dose, it's good for the respiratory tract. High dose, it causes nausea and vomiting. And I know it works because one of my friends and now a colleague, he had a cold and he was asking me, he wasn't one of my students at the time. I think he was in fourth year or third year, and he had a bad cold, and we were just sort of chatting. He said, oh, what herbs could I use as an expectorant? And I said, oh, well, you could use something like Indian, or you could use, there's a bunch of antiviral herbs that I recommended. And I told him lomatium, but he thought I said lobelia. And so he used the wrong dose for it when he went home and he was experimenting on himself. And he took too much of the lobelia instead of the lomatium, which is a good antiviral herb. And shortly afterwards, he vomited. So when it comes to using Indian tobacco, you want to get the right dose. There's no patients don't really like vomiting, so there's no point in causing inducing vomiting if you don't have to. So Indian tobacco work on that mechanism. Things like eucalyptus, which you'll find essential oils, eucalyptus oil in various cough drops and some of those rubs that you apply to your chest. When you inhale eucalyptus, what it does is those essential oils, they're a little bit irritating to the mucous membranes. And as we mentioned before, they have a bit of a, they irritate them. They have a rubefacient effect when topically, but internally, they make the area red. They increase blood supply to the area. And because they're bugging it, your body naturally produces mucus to try to protect itself from, caustic chemicals. And so eucalyptus oil, it is toxic. There's no doubt about it. In small amounts, it just slightly stimulates mucus production, and that helps you clear the mucus that's accumulating in your lungs and your respiratory tract. Horehound, I don't really know how it works. It's a great herb as an expectorant to help clear the lungs. It can be used as a tea. It was once used to make candies, like horehound candy, which is mixed with sugar or honey, and then given to kids when they're sick. That's very, very bitter. So I don't know the mechanism for that one. And then finally, licorice, as I mentioned before, we know that it inhibits one of the enzymes. If you recall, when you take a drug that's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, like aspirin or ibuprofen or diclofenac, those drugs decrease inflammation, but one of the side effects is because they inhibit both the cyclooxygenase 2, which is involved with inflammation, they also inhibit cyclooxygenase 1, which is an enzyme that is not involved with inflammation, but rather it's involved with maintaining the integrity of the mucous membranes. And so if you suppress cyclooxygenase 1, you actually decrease mucus production, and it increases the risk of getting a stomach ulcer. So licorice helps produce more mucus in the stomach because it supports the production of certain prostaglandins that's involved with the cyclooxygenase 1 enzyme. But in addition to that, licorice also produces more mucus in the respiratory tract. So through the cyclooxygenase prostaglandin molecules, it generates more mucus. And a common question that I've seen is that people will say, well, if you have a condition where there's already a lot of phlegm in the chest, in the respiratory system, why would you want to produce more mucus? And the reason why is that if you've got thick, chunky mucus that's stuck in the lungs, and you tell your body to make more thin and watery mucus, it helps to dissolve that mucus that's stuck or sticking to your lungs, so that it helps to wash it off, and then helps to dissolve it so it's easier to cough up. So that's why you take an expectorant, is even when you got a lot of phlegm and mucus, it can help to expectorate and cough it out. Now, if you had something like really bad asthma where there's a lot of mucus and the mucus was watery and bubbly, taking an expectorant may, like licorice, may or may not be the best choice, but it is included in certain Chinese formulas for asthma as well. So here's Indian tobacco or puke wood, puke weed. It's used as an expectorant and emetic, and it does have some antispasmodic effects as well. I've already sort of mentioned that there. Eucalyptus oil, I've mentioned how it works. I forgot to put these slides in. I guess I could have gone through these. We know that horehound, as I mentioned before, it stimulates bronchial secretions, and it also relaxes smooth muscles, so it has a bit of an antispasmodic effect on the lungs too. Now, I probably shouldn't use brand names, but here's, if you look at a few common products that you can find in probably any 24-hour convenience store or any pharmacy or any grocery store, something like Vicks Vapor Rub, the main active ingredients in that is menthol, camphor, eucalyptus, turpentine oil, and thyme oil. So those are all essential oils that act as expectorants, rubefacents, have some antiseptic effects as well. Some of these cough drops that are on the market, they can contain elderflower, elderberries, also horehound, hyssop. We didn't talk about hyssop. Hyssop's a lot like horehound. Certain types of mallows, peppermint, lots of different herbs that have antimicrobial and expectorant effects. And then also Fisherman's Friends contains menthol, a little bit of cayenne, some eucalyptus oil, and some licorice. Now, really quickly, I'm going to finish off on the expectorant and talk about Fisherman's Friends. So Fisherman's Friends, and I'm not getting any money from advertising for Fisherman's Friend, but a quick little story to end off with is I was at a bachelor party way up north. It's like 3 or 4 hours away from a hospital, and we had a bachelor party up there with 30 guys, and we were drinking beer and eating lots of meat like men do. And on the Friday night when I arrived, I'd had a few drinks. I mean, not that many, but I had a few drinks. And one of the guys, when I walked to the front of the house to get something for my car, I noticed him bent over, and I thought maybe he was vomiting, and I went up to him and said, "You okay?" Because I was like, "Is he already wasted? It's only like 8 o'clock and he's vomiting." And he said, "No, I got this piece of meat stuck on my throat." And he had this weird bubbly whistle when he spoke, and I was like, "Ooh, this isn't good. He's got a partial obstruction in his airways." And I said, "Okay, first things first, you should never go away when you get this problem, because I know you're trying to be polite, but this is how people die. They wander off and go by themselves because they're kind of embarrassed that they're choking, and then something changes and it gets stuck in the throat, and then they die." So I told him I'll stay with him until we get it figured out, and I tried doing the Heimlich maneuver a couple times on him, but because it was a partial obstruction, it wouldn't clear. And so as a result, that didn't work. So we tried that for 5 or 10 minutes. that didn't work. And I was worried because I'd been drinking, and most people at the party, everyone at the party had been drinking. So none of us should be driving, and the hospital was a couple hours away. So if things went bad, we'd be in trouble. And so I was a little bit worried. And this guy was getting a little panicky because he was having troubles breathing, and you could hear it whistling and bubbling. It was really disconcerting. Um, so I gave him a little bit of water, and that, you're not supposed to do that, but that didn't work. And hit him on the back a few times, which you're not supposed to do, and that didn't work either. So just because there was nothing I knew of, and not the Heimlich maneuver just should work, but it wasn't. So he kind of was looking at me, and you know, kind of like, is there anything else you can think of? So I kind of racked my brain, and I thought, well, maybe this meat's stuck in the trachea, and the smooth muscles are cramping up on it. So maybe if I give him an expectorant, and I knew that I had Fisherman's Friends in the car, that might help. So ran to the car, I gave him a Fisherman's Friend, and so how it probably what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to increase mucus production and relieve the spasming. So I gave him that, and then within about 10 seconds of putting the Fisherman's Friends in his mouth, he suddenly just coughed, and this piece of meat flew out of his throat. And he looked at me like, "Oh my God, you saved my life!" And I was like, "Oh, all right, that worked. That was fantastic." So I was kind of feeling like the MacGyver of herbal medicine at this point because this is an off-label indication for Fisherman's Friend. Um, but I thought, you know what? If it helps to expectorate phlegm, why not expectorate a piece of meat? And it worked like a charm. And considering he had this, we were out there working on this for about 20 or 30 minutes before we finally get to Fisherman's Friend, and it just immediately coughed it out. So that's my little story about using expectorant. So it's designed to help expectorate phlegm, but you can also use it for beef as well. So I think that's it. If there's any questions, I'll have a quick look, and then we can finish it off there for the day. Okay, so I don't see any questions. If anything comes in afterwards, I can always answer them next week. So we'll start off next time on the urinary tract, gastrointestinal. I'm probably not going to be able to get through everything, all the actions before the midterm. So I think I might end up having to stop at cardiovascular or the female reproductive system. I'll let you know. I'm going to work on the exam today, and I'll post how far we're going to go for the exam. And oh, I got one thing. Someone asked, what is the meaning of SP or SPP dot on the slides? That just means species. So you could have one herb like Glycyrrhiza. I might say Glycyrrhiza SPP because multiple species are used in herbal medicine. So it's not just one. So when it comes to, I forget where I've mentioned that before, oh, like Salix SPP or SP dot, that just means any of the willow species. So it could be white willow, black willow, etc. Okay? Anyways, you guys have a great week. I'll try to post this video in the next couple days. I have to wait for a few hours before it's ready, and then I have to upload it to to YouTube and then post the link. So there's a bit of a process. So I usually don't get to it for a couple days, in case you're wondering, just because I'm busy. But anyways, we'll talk to you guys soon. Okay? Have a great week, and see you next week.